What's up, and welcome to Clarity for Parents of Athletes, bringing you stories from professional athletes about their parents and how they were raised. My name is Gabe Nosair from aclearmind.com. All right, and welcome to episode number 18. Now, before I talk about our next guest, I want to sincerely ask you to review, rate, subscribe, and share this podcast. You know, the more that you do so, the more people become aware of it, and the more people that become aware of it, the more parents can benefit, which trickles down to the children. And I'm sure you've seen it a lot of times, whether it's somebody on your child's team or another team, or maybe even your child, that the parents sometimes need a little guidance, and that's what these interviews are for. So as you can tell, the episodes include some very, very deep thoughts, and my next guest goes very deeply as well. So when I met Robert Ian Bonnick, I was on vacation in Bali, and we were in a city called Canggu. Bali is in case you don't know, it's a small island, one of the Indonesian islands, and it's basically like a big spiritual hub. There's a lot of spirituality, a lot of yoga. A lot of people go in there for transformation, which is something Rob talks about in the interview. So anyway, I was walking through this tiny little outdoor mall when I saw him inside his cafe, and he said, "What's up?" to me. I walked in, and we instantly connected. I ended up seeing him basically every day while we were in the area, because we were pretty close, and there was a playground over there that my son liked to go play in. So after talking to him a few times, I found out that he played basketball for the English national basketball team. So I asked him if he wanted to be a guest on my podcast, and he agreed to, even before asking what the podcast was about, which I didn't even tell him until we started the interview. His story is so unique that I can't imagine I'll ever find someone who grew up with a similar family situation who went on to be a high-level athlete as well. Now, just to give you a heads up, we recorded this interview outside of his cafe with a different type of microphone, so the quality is different than the other interviews I've done, but I hope you can look past that because Rob's story is so incredibly unique and amazing. So you're going to hear a lot of motorbikes, some children, people walking by, just noise, but again, I hope you can look past that and listen to what he's saying. So my takeaways this episode are at the end, not in a separate episode since it's going to be a little bit shorter than the other one. So please keep listening for my thoughts and takeaways after the interview with Rob. All right, enjoy. All right, so Robert, let me first of all thank you for doing this. This is very impromptu, and usually I structure things to where I'm recording podcast episodes with somebody either on the phone or via computer, but I met you in Bali at your place called Life in Bali, which for anyone listening, if you come to Bali and go to Canggu, I would highly recommend that you stop by here. It's a really cool spot and just a good environment. And you and I locked eyes, and you said, "What's up?" to me, and I walked into your place, and boom, here we are. So I appreciate your time doing this.
Oh, welcome, Brother G. Yeah, welcome. And so Life in Bali, life with a Y, because the I was already taken, man.
Oh, of course.
Life in Bali in Bravo.
Yeah.
Pleasure to meet you. Pleasure.
Thank you. So, yeah, you have no idea what the podcast is about, which I think is awesome, that you just agreed to do with it, but you fit the mold. So I'll tell you a little bit of what it is, and I'll structure it exactly like I do with the other interviews. So the podcast is called Clarity for Parents of Athletes. And so it's a podcast designed for parents of athletes. So it's what I typically do is I interview high-level athletes about their childhood and their history and how they got to the point of being such a high-level athlete. And you're not just a high-level athlete, but you've done a lot of other high-level things, which I'd like to hear about as well. But for the meantime, the way I start these is to get the history of who I'm interviewing, and so I'd like for you to take it away because you have a very, very unique history and family life that I'd love to hear about.
Cool. So I hope, yeah. So cool. So yeah, my name is Robert Ian Bonnick, and I'm a English-born Jamaican, and I had a very interesting way of growing up because it wasn't the conventional way of growing up per se. I grew up in 2 children's homes from 6 months to the age of 18 in London. My parents had like a fatal attraction of sorts, and my older sister, myself, and my younger brother consequently felt the brunt of that. So my life started from the age of 6 months being left on the doorstep of where my father was living in London. He came home, didn't really realize what was going on. I don't really think he's 20 years of age. So we end up growing up in these 2 children's homes in London from 6 months to 18. So while I was there, though, I learned so many things about life, about people, about myself, and I still look back and believe it was kind of an extraordinary experience, some of which I'll pass on. So 18, 6 months to 18, growing up there in London. Now, 18 kids living there at any one point in time. I was always the youngest one. So, youngest kid, when you reach the age of 17 and a half, 18, you move out, and then you're replaced by another one. So as I'm progressing from 6 months towards 18, there's tens, probably hundreds of people which have come through, which are there for shorter periods of time than myself. But in a way, they all left me with something, some insight on either how to live life or maybe how not to. One guy was shot in the head, he didn't make it. So many different stories, But the things which I take on board is just this understanding of community, an understanding of that, that we're all the same, no matter where we come from in terms of the wrapper, which is called our skin color, or the ideology that we particularly follow, or the religion that we follow. There are so many things which we have in common. And from very early on in my life, I realized that part of my purpose was about uniting people and bringing people together. And that children's home taught me so much, because it was a place where you would find community. You would find other things too. I was fighting a lot with some of the kids in there. And, there were things that happened that I'm not necessarily that proud of. But that was life, Yet, when it came down to it, when there was a threat from an outside force that came in, then we'd all galvanize together, and we wouldn't recognize our differences any longer. We wouldn't recognize our age difference, our color difference, our background difference, our ideological differences in religion, and how we see people. We just came together as one family, and that's what I took on board. So moving forward, sport was something which really helped me to process some of the things which I was going through at that time. There was anger, there was rage, there was jealousy, there was discontent of all sorts of descriptions and shapes and sizes. So sport gave me the way, because I excelled naturally at sport, hand-eye ball coordination, athletic build. So I excelled naturally at sport. So once I realized that sport could give you advantages in life, could give you privileges. I was probably one of the only kids in care that was sponsored by, it was Adidas back in those days, because I did really well in basketball, so I was sponsored. Because I was sponsored, then I became like the poster kid for the fact that the broken system of children's homes actually worked, which it probably didn't. But I just happened to excel in sport, so I was put on this pedestal of, well, look, if you study hard, you can become this. If you get good grades at school, you can become this. And so that I was used in that kind of a way, which I didn't really mind, because being sponsored by Adidas was great. Going on skiing trips every year was great, and all the other things which came along with that, So I absolutely made the most of it. But one of the things which really blew my mind, because I was an introverted extrovert from a very young age. So at home, I was an introvert. At school, I was an extrovert. But the interesting part came in getting into the England basketball team. Number one, I didn't realize that I could do it. So I had all of that pre-programming, conditioning that was surrounding me, which was one of, you're a black kid growing up in a white school for the first 14 years, you're the only black kid at school. I had a different set of values that I was following that wasn't really in line with who I was. And But yeah, so I was struggling with achievement, and I was struggling with, ways to find peace. So when I eventually got into the England basketball team, which I didn't think I could do, but I really wanted to do, then what that showed me was that I began to wake up to the understanding that whatever I decide I can do, whichever limitations I either put on myself, either consciously or subconsciously, has an impact into how life shows up for me, which is a really important point. So then after that, the delusions of grandeur kind of really started to head my way, and I started to achieve other things. So on leaving care, I started to travel around the world, still playing basketball at a fairly elite level. At that time, it was already becoming more towards the background. And then, but then things like, I ended up becoming a model and working with the supermodels at that time, which were Naomi Campbell and Evangelista and Herzegovina, and then ended up working with Madonna on one project, and then moved to Australia and ended up running nightclubs, which again was community driven, because again, nightclubs, I wasn't there for the sex, drugs and rock and roll at all. I was there because it was a place where you could bring large amounts of people together and exercise that community building aspect that was becoming part of me, which, remember, I had the training already through growing up in a children's home with many different types of kids, working out life, working out people, working out the fact that we're all the same, spending time in sport, being put on the pedestal, having all of that experience, working with some of the most high-profile people on earth, and realizing that they're just the same as you and me, have the same or different, but we're united with the same. There's things for them to heal. There's challenges for them to face, which they either decide to face or run away from. And that's present within you, whether you have money or you don't have money, whether you have fortune and fame, whether you don't have fortune and fame, whether you're spiritual or not spiritual. So I had the advantage of having all these different lessons of learning, and I brought that together in the arena called nightclubs. And then we ended up running a nightclub that was voted number three in the world. But again, that was just me exercising this natural ability and genius that I was kind of born with, that was also shaped in the way that I grew up, to bring people together with a higher vision of just kind of recognizing who we are as people, what we're capable of as people, and that we in ourselves hold our success or failure from that duality standpoint of whether we are fulfilled in our life, whether that's elite sports, some of the highest, most prominent businesses in the world, or whether we decide to take on family. I have two little kids, three and 5. They teach me things every single day, but these were all things that were not within the viewpoint of this kid who grew up in an orphanage or 2 children's homes in London. It wasn't the path that was awaiting for me. So most of the kids which I grew up with ended up going in different ways. I've mentioned one who got shot. There's many who ended up in prison, many who ended up mentally, physically, emotionally challenged and never really got past that. There were some great success stories as well. And again, I learned from everyone. Growing up, I learned from all of those kids. As it turns out, I found out recently that in my family tree, the Jamaican Maroons, there's people like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, and one I'm missing, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. They were Jamaican Maroons, yeah, and that's my background. So all of these things have kind of come out since that time, which in a way helped to fill the backstory that I never even knew I had. Which in a way, depending if you believe in purpose or not, has driven me to certain ends and certain goals, which have given me a lot of clarity around things. So I'll hand it back to you, and I'm sure there's some other questions you have.
I've got more popping up by the minute. Yeah. So, I firmly believe that we're born into this world a completely blank slate, and then we become programmed by the people around us. And for the majority of people, it's their parents, whether it's parents who are still married or parents who are divorced. We're around them the most. but in your case, it's completely different. So, who do you feel like your biggest influences were while you were in the children's home? And did you have somebody that you connected with as like a mother figure and also somebody as a father figure?
Great question. So there were many people, and in many ways, before I answer that question fully, before I answer that question fully, for me, I believe I've been guided. The amount of things that have happened to me, or should have happened to me that didn't. The amount of people that I've met who always showed me love when they didn't need to, that asked me to do certain things, maybe turn left instead of turning right, and right would have been death. So many times. So I come from a place of an understanding that we're part of something much larger, that also has a big impact on what things happen to us, and we can control certain things. We have a mastery over certain things on how we respond. But there's something which is of a higher nature that we're part of, that is expressed within us, and has a guidance over things that involve us as well. But stepping back to, because I also believe in conditioning, and that theta brainwave state from the ages of 1 to 7, and then the role that the RAS plays later on, that then brings to us those experiences that we're already aligned with, in the same way as two people looking at the same information can draw two completely different conclusions on the way that they've been programmed and the way that they've been tuned and brainwashed to a certain extent, if you want to call programming brainwashing for a second. So on growing up, for me, there were two cleaners, Betty and Doris, who were there for the lion's share of the time of the second children's home that I was in, and they actually played a role more of solidity. They were stable. They both had families, or what one did, and somehow we always managed to get along and ended up hanging out and talking, or them listening and me talking, or vice versa. And they would give me advice, and they would share their opinion on how we were being parented and so on. And in many ways, how we were being parented, they didn't really align with either. So that was one set of people that definitely gave me some sense of uniformity somehow. Another one was a guy called Monty Edwards, and Monty wasn't there for a long period of time, though his impact lasted a long time. And I'm still in touch with Monty now, and he was a guy who was he's a black dude and Afro-Caribbean heritage as well. And he was interesting because what I didn't realize at the time was that he was fighting against a system that was based upon, I wouldn't necessarily put it down to Christianity or religion per se, but it was based upon an Anglo-Saxon heritage and way of doing stuff. And the way that he preferred it to be, not that he was against that, but the way that he preferred it to be was to be balanced towards the individual. So he knew that I was Jamaican or had Jamaican heritage, so wanted me to learn about my Jamaicanness as well, and not just one history, but multiple histories. So he was really interesting because even with the food that he cooked, the music that he listened to, the way that he lived his life was typically, Jamaican, and the way that he would speak to us, and the books he would ask us to read or read from, bedtime stories, that kind of thing, gave us a particular insight into a different direction that we were being given at the time, which was mainly Catholic, or actually Anglo-Saxon way of kind of growing up. Another member of staff, Gail, she was the lady who was in charge as such, and she was a Christian herself, but a beautiful lady, really cool, very giving, very generous. I think with Gail is probably more about generosity. That's one thing which I learned from her. Lil was another lady who I thought was a disciplinarian, and apparently I turned out to be quite wrong when I was writing the book. I got that one the wrong way around. But again, with Lil, she was generous. But what I also learned was the power of, committing to something. When you commit to something, to follow it through, regardless of how you're feeling that particular day. If you got a cold, or if you're a bit tired, or which I guess relates to work ethic, which obviously becomes really important when you're doing things like sport at an elite level of business and so on, because there are lots of times when you're not really in the mood to do certain things, but something else takes over. Who else? Which other members of staff? There's quite a few. Kate was another one. Kate Browning. She was just extremely generous as well, and lovely. So she, in a way, she taught me about love through acts of love. I guess we have different love languages. Some it's kinesthetic, some it's, thinking about them. Some it's audio, clairsentient, clear audio of saying things. But she was definitely a doer. Like you could tell, from the way that she cook us our favorite meals all the time, even when she was tired and didn't want to be there. It was acts of love, acts of kindness. And who else comes to mind? Ooh. So there are other kids though, other kids. I mean, there were many kids there. When I say kids, they were all older than me. Remember, I was always the youngest one, but they were still kids. They're all under 18, under 17 most of the time. So I remember Lee, the guy that got shot, that got killed, shot while playing pool in London. That was crazy, in a pub. One thing I got from him was about being your own person. Be your own man. He was this precocious kid. Again, Afro-Caribbean descendant, though. He's a white Jamaican-looking guy, and he was all about having pride and following that through. There was another guy, Gary Lee, great football player, martial artist, incredible chef, one of the first black chefs in, I think it's either the Dorchester or the Savoy Hotel in London, which was a huge thing. So he taught me about, how to volley in tennis, how to play football, how to behave, how to talk to women. He was a womanizer of the most incredible appeal and dimension. There were other guys there who taught me about how to act and how not to act. There was one guy, Brian, who wasn't part of the orphanage, but he was living there half the time, it felt. Brian, what was a petty crim, meaning a petty criminal, and like 6 foot tall, dressed like a skinhead. So that's like what we call drain pipe jeans, skin tight jeans. So he's a tall, skinny guy, bald head, bomber jacket, and the 18 to 21 hole steel cap boots. So now, so far, he fits into the typical description of what a skinhead was wearing, with the braces that connect to the jeans, with a white shirt underneath the bomber jacket. But he had one big difference. He decided to get a tattoo, and for most people, tattoos can be on your arm or on your shoulder or somewhere that's concealed by clothing. Not for our friend Brian. Brian decided to get, I think it was like a spider on the side of his face with a cobweb. So so it's kind of recognizable instantly. And he would do things like break into around the corner from where we lived was a supermarket, single story. The doors were locked, chained, and he came in through the skylight of the roof, dropped in like some commando, not figuring a way out. So the alarms were triggered, the silent alarms, and there he was, going shopping after the supermarket was closed. Chains on the doors, dark outside, silent alarm going off, police already notified, and they were like one kilometer away. Yeah. So they're already on the way, and he's figured out that he's got everything he needs, and now he wants to get out. realizes that the doors are bolted from the outside, and realizes that there's got nothing in there to get him back to the skylight, which is about 11 foot, 12 feet high. So he's just stuck there. Police open the door, come in. Oh, there he is, sitting down, arrest him, take him back to his second home, the prison. But then, it didn't stop there. He would do things like, he would go and rob people, and then finally, when the police would catch up to the victim, so look, is there anything distinguishing about the person? Yeah, there was actually. He's about 6 foot tall, skinhead, and that's right. Yeah, he had this tattoo on the side of his face, a spider with a cobweb. Thank you much indeed. Yeah, So
he didn't blend in.
He didn't blend in. So there were so many different role models, for doing the right thing and doing the other thing, And I learned from everybody, and I mean. The amount of times where I got into tough situations, because I was a bully at school early on, and then one day I got my just desserts, hit some guy and hit him 3 times, and I woke up in hospital. Apparently my punches had really no effect on him, but one of his punches had a great effect on me. After that I stopped being a bully. Yeah, that was a good choice. So I had different lessons, I had different lessons to learn, and different people who felt duty bound to lay those lessons upon me, to teach me. But the funny thing is that in times, because I have a great amount of resilience, and again, I learned resilience there in that children's home. I learned resilience from those other kids. Having to fight on a Saturday morning with the same kid. I learned resilience through, getting up to do this milk round in the morning where I didn't want to go. It was raining, and the weather in London can be brutal. Cold, snowing, and you're wearing shorts during this milk round in the morning. I learned resilience through, finding ways not to get beaten up, by becoming a joker. So my winning formula ended up being, becoming this comedian at home, so then I wouldn't get bullied, because no one really wants to bully a guy who's making them laugh. Right. So that was the way I got out of. So all in all, I was figuring out people. I was figuring out how to get along with anyone, because then you develop this sense of, which people are a threat to you, which people are not, which people can cause you harm in other ways and which people won't. So you learn all this stuff. So by the time when I got to Sydney running nightclubs, I spent a lot of time working at the front door, a lot of time. So I would deal with people of all shapes and sizes, criminals, thugs, lawyers who are drunk, trying to explain to me why they're going to come in and why I'm breaking the law. And so I learned to communicate with all different kinds of people on all different kinds of levels, to the point where now I'm so comfortable with people, in the sense that there isn't any place or any room or any situation that you couldn't drop me in that I don't feel that I could come out on top with. And that's not an ego thing. It's just coming back to melting and realizing time and time again that we're all the same. So when I'm with people which are strangers, I come from that place of understanding that we're all the same, regardless of what lies before me. But all of these things I learned growing up. I learned growing up in that children's home. I learned about racism. Growing up in that children's home, and that racism is actually ignorance, to the point where I had a very strong racist incident that happened to me some years ago, and out of it, okay, I'll tell you a little bit. So from the age of around 12, at school, in history, studying a war called the 100 Years' War. This particular 100 Years' War was in the Middle East. But as we know, there are many 100 years wars going on all over the world, some far longer than 100 years. So this kid behind me who sat in our class put his hand up and said, "Miss, yes, the 100 Years War, yes? It can't be the same people fighting, can it?" And that just went right over my head. I really didn't understand. But then years later, when I was walking past a pub in London, and I got this call, and I won't use the N word, but that was a word that was used. "Oi, N word, go back to your own country." And then what proceeded to happen after that was involved 10 or 15 guys and 2 of us, which ended up being 1 of us, because I was the guy who ended up running away after getting a little beating while my friend was getting a much bigger beating because he wasn't able to run away. But the day after, the morning after that, it was interesting how it affected me, because at the time I was embarrassed, upset, scared, but I felt like I let my friend down, that this friend of mine got a beating instead of me, and I should have gone back and got beaten too or something, you know. And then I was angry because even though I was 12, I was a bully at school. Yet these were adults, and there was something psychological that was there that wouldn't allow me to strike. And so that just pissed me off. So then I had all those emotions, you know, revenge, you know, let's go back, let's just do this, you know. But it was interesting because the next day, you know, I woke up with this complete clarity of understanding that I need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So then, in the same way as the 100 Years War does not involve the same people fighting, it's a message that is passed down from parents to offspring on why you should hate someone based on the color of their skin, the religion that they follow, the ideology that they have, and so on. That's what it really is. Absolutely, 100%. So then I realized, you know, at the age of 13, 14, you know, that like I have to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Meaning, I have to find ways to bring us together, not to separate us. And that was a question from the age of 12 that stayed with me, and it came back again. Again, guidance, being tapped on the shoulder, call it whatever you want to call it, synchronicity, whatever you want to call it. But that's the way I took it on board. And so ever since about 14, 15, I've been on that mission. You know, 16, that mission of just, you know, how can I find ways to bring us together? And then I realized that that unconscious robot, the guys who attacked me and my friend, were not conscious. They were unconscious robots. Unconscious robot meaning programmed, right? So then I saw racism in a whole new light, and that light was, you know, an understanding of just ignorance. So because I saw it that way for the last 25 years or more, racism has never touched me again. And again, does racism exist? Yes. But has it touched me? No. Why? Because it's no longer part of my awareness, in the sense of, you know, when you really truly embrace something, it no longer has dominion over you. But when you leave it in the darkness and put it aside and extricate it from yourself, then it has more power living in the shadows than it does living in the light. And so that's a lot of the work which I do with people now around community is allowing people to see that for themselves, more so allow them to find their own source of ultimate intelligence, for them to figure out their own way in their own life, as I'm doing in mine. Yeah.
So I think that's extremely powerful. So I just want to go in a little bit more what you're doing now and how you're trying to help people and bring people together and raise the overall consciousness of the people around you. How are you doing that?
Yeah. Consciousness is an interesting thing. So I'll answer that in three different ways. So the first one is that a little while ago, kind of dropped into my head one day that there's perhaps 3 pillars of purpose. And the first pillar of purpose is that purpose of having no purpose. And I feel that, the time when I was traveling around after I finished playing basketball at a high level, and I was running around the world, modeling and acting and singing and dancing and all that stuff. I was living in the moment, 100%. Wasn't really too bothered about the future or the past. Was just interested in living the moment. And obviously, as we all know, like living in the present is an absolute gift. If you can, the more you can do that, the more fulfilled and more fulfillment you'll have, and the more fulfillment you have, the happier you'll be. So that was the first pillar of purpose. By the way, none of these pillars is better or worse than the other. It's just where you might be at this point in time. The second pillar of purpose is having a purpose. So, for example, I mentioned before about Martin Luther King and the other two, Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. Thank you. Being in my lineage, the way that I grew up. If I work backwards and say that the purpose of my life is to bring people together in community, to show us that we're all the same, and to give us tools for our own self-realization, then what would be the best way that I could grow up? Would have been the way I grew up. Children's home, orphanages, children,
That made you who you are.
Exactly. Only black kid at school, white school for the first 13, 14 years. All the rest of that, living in Italy, learning a different language, all of that. So if I rely upon that purpose, but purpose tends to be perhaps a pushing away from, so it's like I'm pushing away from something. I didn't have this, so therefore I want to have this and give it to the world. That kind of thing. The third pillar of purpose is almost about like a calling, so it involves elements of the other two, but it's separate because it's something which perhaps you didn't even know about. You might watch something on TV and it just affects you, or you might speak to someone and they share a story and it just affects you in a way that is not incongruous with who you are, but in a way that might surprise you. So you might burst into tears or become teary, or physically you feel something in your body which is like, oh, it's like a pull towards something. And what you're able to do is that you're available to actually do something about it. Not only are you available to do something about it, you do something about it. Why? Because you can. And you have the ability to do that. So it's being pulled towards something, not pushed away from something. So that is what I mean in terms of a calling, like an insight, like a very powerful, poignant aha moment that goes deep to the core of who you believe yourself to be. So that in this particular description is how I would describe the third pillar of purpose. Where I am right now is in between 2 and 3. So to answer your question of, what is it I'm doing in the world now, like Bali as a place, I find to be one of the most transformative places where I've been. Not to say that transformation doesn't happen anywhere else, because that's simply not true. Because transformation is about where you are, right? And that can be anywhere in the world. But I'm just saying that energetically as a place, it just seems to have that appeal to many people. Retreats. It's the highest Instagram location on earth.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, Bali, yeah. So it's crazy. So like here, and we end up in this place in Canggu called Life in Bali, Tamora Gallery, the first lifestyle shopping village in Canggu. And, and then we're doing this cafe because we believe that was the easiest way for us to make some money when we first got here, and then realized that it's not really the easiest way to make money here at all. And it's actually been really struggle. It's been very, very tough. But in that toughness, in the same way as, carbon forced, crushed, squeezed under pressure makes diamond, right? It's what happens to us if we look at it that way. So here at one stage, what it was this realization that we're trying to compete on a way of food and beverages in a place that has a gazillion choices. of food and beverages.
Crazy.
You know, from, you know, award-winning chefs who are selling it for peanuts. So it's like there are we, not on the street, but inside, you know, the first development of its kind, you know, trying to compete on that. And it's like, well, that isn't going to work. So then it became, well, what is it we do? What is it we can do that distinguishes us and separates us from anyone else? You know, like what is our area of unique ability? And we all have an area of unique ability, all of us, you know? So it's like, and then I bumped into this friend of mine, Morten, is another speaker, Norwegian guy. And he was like, Rob, you know, like, why aren't you speaking here? You know? And that started this cavalcade of downloads, which hasn't stopped, and I don't think it will. Out of that then came, you know, a true understanding of like, that's right. You know, my purpose is about empowering people. It's about creating community. It's about that, you know. And then that reminder was kind of all that I needed. And ever since then, it's just things drop in. And the things which have been dropping in at this point in time have been around. I mean, here Monday night we do a night called Speak Up. And, you know, the highlight of that one for me, they're all highlights because everyone is different, but it's the understanding of empowerment, of reminders, of inspiration, in the sense that we have an intimate space. We don't use keynotes. It's all about one person's heart connecting with many. And you know, like, we've had like, we're up to number 14 now. Probably my favorite one was that I somehow managed to get hold of the first Indonesian woman to climb the 7 highest mountains on earth.
Oh.
Yeah, including Everest. And this little girl called Matilda Dwi Lestari is a powerhouse, and I've got a feeling that I'm going to end up managing her. And you heard it here first. she doesn't even know that either, by the way. But it's interesting because, you know, like, all these people have just dropped into my lap, literally. The next one will be the founder of Gojek, which is one of the top 3 companies in Indonesia, in Asia actually, I think. So he'll be here doing a speak up, and many types of people in between. That the guy who created the Singapore Marathon, the guy who created Iron Man, you know, like, that's a guy called another friend called Chris Robb, who's got a company called Mass Participation World now, which will underpin the mass participation movement on a global scale. You know, like, all these people have dropped into my lap. You know, it's crazy. Tuesday is a night we call Unlocking Creativity through painting and writing. Wednesday is a men's circle, which is enormous power. Thursday is a musical evening. And, you know, outside of that, you know, the other role that happens to fall into my lap is driving the marketing and the events and the management for 44 shops. And right now, in the first development of its kind in Bali. And then, so at this point in time, you know, this other idea dropped in my head of doing this big food and wine community event, and we're doing it, which will be the first one in this area that will eventually, in a few years' time, involve tens of thousands of people. So, and again, all of these things were triggered by that one reminder, you know, and things have just been dropping in ever since, you know, and it's incredible how, you know, we all know the word synchronicity and so on, but it is amazing how the universe can conspire,
sure.
You know, to push things your way. And, you know, another great guy, Philip, who I met about 20-something years ago, when he is a filmmaker and a branding genius. He had unfettered access to this enlightened being, most call him, this guy called Muktananda. And we met years ago in Australia when I was following the same man through his disciple, a guy called Nityananda. And then he just reminded me of, you know, I am that. or I am being a really powerful mantra. And again, like the more and more and more, the way that I see life is the understanding that, as you said before, we came in, a blank slate, a blank canvas, but slightly prior to that, we came in knowing everything we needed to know. This intelligence. And then as we come out, and then we start to come in the world and affected by the world, it's like we forget. It's a bit like this is a great analogy which I heard the other day. It's a bit like when you look at the sky, and let's say it's a beautiful blue sky, like when you're going on an airplane journey, and let's say it's cloudy. So what happens is that as you take off, you go through the cloud layer. When you reach the top of the cloud layer, it's during the day. What's behind the cloud? Blue sky. So the blue sky has always been there. Yep. But looking from the ground up, what you see is cloud. So it's like your nature is the sky, blue sky, beautiful, impermanent. Yet, what we allow to cloud over, which you might call the ego.
It's our thinking. That's what it is.
Exactly, right? So then if we, and that's what I mean about, I've used the word remember a lot, because that's where I feel is a way to crack through the cloud layer, is insight coming from the sky, coming through the clouds and hitting you on the ground. All right. And the more insights you get, the more you begin to dissipate the cloud and begin to see who you truly are and your own true nature. And that, if anything, without realizing till about a week ago, well, to be really honest, about 2 days ago, that's really the work that I'm doing.
Yeah. 2 days ago.
Yeah. 2 days ago, 2 days ago, I read a book called I Am That, which was given to me by this friend Philip. Not given, he borrowed me it, but it was Muktananda, actually. It was by Muktananda. It's a short book, about 40 or so pages. I Am That. And again, it just gave me that reminder again. And it's interesting because, these insights keep coming through the cloud layer and hitting me here on the ground, And with each insight, again, it's just there's a little more room. There's like a gap in the clouds, and I can see the sun shining through. And the more insights I have, pretty soon I'm going to need some sunglasses.
Yeah, I mean, our cluttered thoughts, that's what I call it, or contaminated thinking, which is derived from the ego, any kind of lack that we have or that we feel that we have, that's what ends up clouding us, and we can add more clouds. And some people spend their whole lives with clouds, as you're talking about it, blocking out that top layer, blocking out the sun, which is really funny because that's almost the exact same metaphor that I use when I'm explaining the principles of, I call that mind, like your higher power is mind. That's where you get all those downloads, and that's how we're born into this world, is with all the ability that we need, but then our cluttered thinking, when we start thinking a little bit too much from our ego side of ourselves, that's what creates the clouds, and people get stuck in there. So it's awesome that you're helping people and that you've experienced the clouds starting to dissipate more and more over time.